Okay, so the word God in pantheistic thought is very, very sticky sometimes. It's like a big puddle of semantic treacle, and people just keep stepping in it, and mess goes everywhere. For the simple reason that God is thought most generally to denote an all-powerful, omnipotent, all-seeing being, a personal God, if you will, so a theist God who answers prayers or punishes the wicked, and kind of sits on another plane somewhere looking down over what he, because it generally is a he, has created. So a sky god, or a big daddy god as Freud would have called it. And that's kind of what God has come to mean. So when pantheists start talking about God and how they view God and how God is in fact the all, it's very difficult for people to get their heads around what we're talking about, which is why I often choose instead to refer to God as divinity or as the all. I like the all a lot, or source energy, or the energy, that kind of thing, or the key of life. Any of those terms that basically express the spirit, but without referring to a word that could be realistically and understandably mistaken to mean an omnipotent, all-powerful being or set of beings. The reason I think that pantheists so often talk about God and how they view God is in fact to help the vast majority of people who don't understand what pantheism is, who are maybe seeking an explanation, because God is the most straightforward way of saying, the big thing, the all-encompassing thing, the maker, the creator, the essence, the life force. God has become a word that's synonymous with that, but unfortunately then when we start using it, people can't kind of get their minds away from the idea of God as other, or God as supernatural, or God as something that presides over nature and made nature but is itself completely transcendental, omnipotent, and not able to be understood or touched or anything like that. So yeah, God is a difficult word, and that's why I often select the word divinity instead. I remember once somebody telling me that David Attenborough had talked about going to Africa and discovering or finding these parasitic worms, these tiny little parasitic worms or lice of some kind, and basically they exist in and around these very poor African villages, and they tend to crawl into eyes, human eyes, and hatch their young in the eyes, making the sufferer that's had to endure this horrific incident blind. And apparently it happens to children in these African villages. They get this worm in their eye and it hatches their young, sort of in a parasitic fashion underneath the lid, and the child becomes blind. And I remember somebody saying to me, David Attenborough said that he could never believe in a god when things like that happen to people, and when such sort of horrific things exist. And I remember at the time, it was a few years ago now, and I was really angry, and I thought to myself, what a ridiculous thing to say. To assume that God and the whole idea of God that anyone can have on earth is about this interventionist guy that sits on a cloud and decides not to intervene when some little kid gets a parasitic worm in their eye, because I don't care about that. This whole idea that God only exists on that level, that God is this monotheistic, all-powerful, all-seeing being who has the power to do something to help, but doesn't, so he must be a real bastard, he must be a vengeful, uncaring, frivolous, flippant. And I thought to myself, God is a much bigger word than that. God can encompass all kinds of things. God can mean all kinds of things. When I'm talking about God, I'm not talking about that kind of God. To me, the parasitic worm itself is also God. There is no good or bad in nature. Nature to me is cruel and beautiful, awe-inspiring but terrifying. The worst nightmare you've ever had and the best dream you could ever hope to have. For me, there's no dark and light in nature. There's a polarity, because that's how human beings break things down mentally in their mind. There's always a polarity. But the line between yin and yang is that source energy, that thing that unifies the polarities and makes us understand that they all come from the same source. This is what I believe. I believe that if there is dark and light, it comes from one and the same thing. It is one and the same thing, and one is not to be revered while the other is cast asunder. It's all one and the same. And if you can't love nature for what you most despise and hate about it, then do you really love nature? because nature is a lot more than just rainbows and honeysuckle. But then after a few years, I came to realise that David Attenborough is kind of correct in a way, because God has been used in that way to describe this all-powerful being. We are actually wrong as pantheists for adopting it. Reclaiming the word, yeah, we're maybe slowly doing that, but most people, when we say the word God, are going to think of this omnipotent, all-powerful being. So it's kind of best maybe to go for divinity or nature, although nature brings its own problems for me, because I think a lot of people, when you say the word nature and you talk about loving nature, they think you just mean trees and lakes and flowers. But I don't just mean that, I mean all of it. And I believe that what's man-made is natural too. So that, even that brings its problems. So I just like to say the all, or everything, or the divine. The divine's my favourite one. So yeah, God's a bit of a problematic word. Richard Dawkins had something to say about pantheists using the word God, and about how it kind of denigrated their idea of what God is, and that they shouldn't really be using it. Now, I know a lot of people in this community don't like Dawkins, and I know a lot of theists and people that follow the Abrahamic religions want to bloody well kill Dawkins. I, for one, actually like him. I enjoy him a lot. I know he thinks that I'm like a sexed up atheist or a confused atheist, which is what he said about pantheism quite famously. But I enjoy him, and actually when I watch his programmes, I often think that he comes off like an atheist. He sounds like an atheist, like when he stood in the British Museum talking about all the fossils and, you know, the incredible journey of evolution, and how it comforts him that when he dies he's going to be recycled into star stuff again or whatever. Like, he sounds like a pantheist to me. Like, he sounds like somebody that's absolutely in awe and just reveres the whole thing and finds the whole thing innately and cosmically magical. But, you know, he's staunchly atheist, and, you know, anyone that believes in God is having a delusion. So we'll have to agree to disagree. But as I said in my last video, pantheism and atheism are kind of cousins. So, you know, I have a deep affection for atheists, especially atheists that sound really bloody pantheists when they talk about life, love and laundry. But there's something here where, yeah, he says here, the metaphorical or pantheistic God of the physicists is light years away from the interventionist, miracle-wreaking, thought-reading, sin-punishing, prayer-answering God of the Bible, of priests, mullahs and rabbis, and of ordinary language. Deliberately to confuse the two is, in my opinion, an act of intellectual high treason. So what he's saying there is that he can forgive physicists and cosmologists and people with great scientific knowledge for feeling that there is something to be revered about, you know, this world that they're part of, these things they're discovering. But what he can't forgive is equating that thing to be revered, that divinity, with anything to do with God, which is much more based in this kind of punishing, fire and brimstone, big daddy sky god, I'll tell you what to do and you'll kind of be my little infants and do it. He kind of feels that there's a lack of understanding there for the power that the word God actually entails, and he finds it a shame when physicists and learned people who talk about, maybe, you know, I don't believe in a religion per se, but I kind of think that what I do with my life is a spirituality. I'm learning about planets and stars and, you know, all the craziness of the cosmos. I can't not see that as sacred. Dawkins' position is kind of like, okay, if you still want to carry a little bit of the sheep in you and believe that it's like, you know, godly, that's fine, but don't call it God, because there's a clear definition there between Big Daddy Skybosh and, you know, what pantheists feel, which is much more kind of like what Dawkins would see as rational and kind of can be forgiven, can be understood, can be empathised with. I drew a diagram for the end of this video. I'm not sure if this kind of really fits in with the problematic area of the word God, but it was something that I found really funny, and I do kind of find Dawkins funny because he's arrogant, but he's kind of adorable at the same time, and I think he means well. I don't mean that in a patronising sense at all, but this image, I saw it on a programme of his, and it made me laugh a lot. Basically, this is my really like crap version of his picture that he did. Okay, so basically it's a sheep, like a standard sheep kind of on all fours kind of thing. And he's basically stating that if you're a theist, if you believe in a personal God, a God that listens to you, that cares about your problems and answers your prayers and will punish you if you do something bad and is the all-seeing eye of the world, then you are basically at the lowest level of intellectual thought when it comes to spirituality. I'm not saying this is my opinion, this is his opinion entirely. Deism is basically where you do believe in an all-powerful, omnipotent being, but you do not believe that it is a personal God. You believe that it is a God that does not hear you, cannot necessarily see you, does not intervene in human affairs, and will not answer your prayers or necessarily strike you down with a bolt of thunder if you cheat on your wife, but you do accept that it is there. Then he goes on to say that pantheism is slightly more of an evolved sheep than deism, okay? So theism is just on all fours in the farmyard, you know, barring and hanging out with the other sheep. Deism is kind of what he describes as watered down theism. So essentially you're still a bloody stupid sheep, but at least you believe that, you know, if you pray, God won't answer. Then he's got pantheism, which is kind of like as high up on its hind legs as a sheep can stand. So basically what he's saying is we're still sheep and we're still dumb, but at least we believe that God just encompasses everything we can see and everything around us and everything we're part of, instead of believing that it's like a guy in the sky with a thunderbolt. So essentially we're still stupid and we still need to be taught a thing or two, but you know, we're better off than these two classes of spiritual person. Then, of course, the atheist is a man. Atheist ain't no sheep. Atheist does his own thing, you know. Like, as though atheism can't be like a little term that you hide behind or follow or whatever, you know. Atheism is where every smart, straightforward thinking person ends up. And pantheism is just one tragic kind of like, one tragic farmyard day away from, you know, being where you really should be, which is atheist. So I found that really, really funny. And when I first saw it, I was like, that's really offensive. And I kind of felt like, well, at least I'm not on all fours in the farmyard like the theist, but still, I'm still a sheep. So yeah, it's all on what you think. And I think that this idea that we are confused atheists is actually a confused position and an unfortunate position, and not a position that I'll ever agree with. I definitely believe in divinity. There's nothing confused about it. But if atheists want to label me as confused or talk about pantheism like it's sexed up atheism, you know, like we're not quite smart enough to just let the God idea go and be atheist, but deep down we're atheists, we're just having a bit of confusion. You know, if people want to think that, that is totally fine. I'm fine with that. It doesn't bother me. It's no skin off my nose whatsoever, but it's definitely for my part not the truth.